It happened in this little cottage, in the rolling hills and countryside of what is now the Bronx. In about May of 1848, Poe was sitting at his writing desk under the lights of these candelabra. This is not his pen, but this is the penknife that would have been at his side while he wrote. So now we have the full Poe effect. Wait, one more thing. You need the mustache. Now that you have the complete Poe experience, we can begin tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. On that spring evening, Poe was complaining about not being able to write. He said he didn't have any inspiration, he couldn't concentrate. He'd set himself up a pretty difficult task. Up until this point, when Poe wrote a short story or a poem, he was trying to achieve a unified emotional impact on the reader. The Raven's a good example. The Raven, every sentence, every line, every syllable, every color, it is designed to evoke the effect of melancholy on the reader. But in this new poem, Poe wanted to explore a whole range of emotions. The only problem was these church bells nearby kept ringing and making all sorts of racket. In fact, Fordham University says they still have the actual bell that was annoying Poe as he was trying to write his poem. So as Poe's complaining, his nurse, who he wasn't really paying, she was sort of a volunteer, she asked him what was the problem. And he said, "I have no subject, I cannot write." Actually, we have a letter here that his nurse's sister sent to the museum when we got these candelabra from her. And she repeats the oft-told story of how the nurse told Poe, just write a poem about the bells. And she took Poe's pen and across the top of the page wrote, "The bells, ah the bells, the little silver bells." Then handed him the pen, and he wrote the next line. Handed it back. She wrote another. And that's the birth of one of his greatest poems. You'll never guess the name. It's The Bells. So this story's been told many times and embellished each time, but the gist of it is that Poe is inspired to write by the sounds of those bells. And those bells were the formation of the poem. If you look at the first printing of it, in fact, in the November 1849 issue of Sartain's Union magazine, the layout of the poem almost looks like bells. In fact, the word bells is repeated so many times that it starts to sound like the ringing of bells. It's a device called onomatopoeia. It goes bells, 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 bells. And then when he finished it, he sent it off to Sartain's magazine, and then he changed his mind. The poem at this point was 18 lines long, but he decided it needs to be longer. So he completely rewrote it and made it 112 lines long. That's the version that's printed right here in Sartain's. The November issue, which came out October 15th, 1849, which, if you're doing the math, is 1 week and 1 day after Poe's death. And this poem goes through the whole cycle of life, from beginning with the merry tinkling of little silver bells to the continuing through the golden wedding bells, the loud alarum bells, and ending with the iron bells tolling death and despair. So it's not only a whole cycle of life, it's a whole cycle of emotions ending with that, according to Poe, most poetical of all emotions, melancholy. And the poem was an instant hit. As soon as it was printed in Sartain's, other magazines, newspapers all over the country picked it up and reprinted it. And one of them in particular, the November 10th issue of the Saturday Evening Post, reprinted it with their introduction that said, "We consider the following even more extraordinary and original poem than The Raven. The chime of the bells rings and swells through its carefully chosen words and artfully contrived lines and periods. It is a fine exercise for those who wish to perfect themselves in reading, while no one but Mrs. Kimball, perhaps, could read it as it ought to be read. Imagine that. If Poe had lived longer and had the chance to tour around the country, giving readings of the bells just like he gave readings of the Raven, maybe instead of kids following around town saying, nevermore, nevermore, they'd be following around town saying, the bells, 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 bells. Instead of having the Baltimore Ravens, you might just have the Baltimore Bells. And what about that end of that little introduction? You know, the part that said it's a fine exercise for those who wish to perfect themselves in reading, while no one but Mrs. Kimball perhaps could read it as it ought to be read? Well, Fanny Kimball was one of the best actresses in the country at the time. And this reviewer is saying that the poem is so musical that it really needs to be read by somebody who's a skilled actor. And since then, plenty of actors have tried their hand at performing the bells. Here's screen legend Basil Rathbone trying it.
Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with the crystalline delight.
And this is professional Poe actor Norman George, who's actually trying to read this as he thinks that Poe would have read the poem.
To the swinging and the ringing of the bells, bells, bells.
And since then, there have been choral versions, jazz versions, all sorts of other interpretations of the poem. That one wasn't too bad. In 1913, the Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff created a choral symphony version of the bells. And the Poe Museum here even has the sheet music from 1906 for English composer Joseph Holbrook's version for chorus and grand orchestra. And here's the Latin Ballet of Virginia dancing to me, reading the bells. Hear the tolling of the bells, iron bells, what a world of solemn thought their monody compels. In the silence of the night, how we shiver with the fright and the melancholy meaning of their tone. And let's not forget the numerous visual artists who've attempted to interpret the bells. Here's an 1881 volume with illustrations by a number of artists, including Poe's own friend, Felix O.C. Darley. And here's Edmund Dulac's book, The Bells and Other Poems of Edgar Allan Poe from 1923. Check this one out. And people are still coming up with unique interpretations even today. Here's a comic book version by Rafael Nieves and Juan Gomez. We even have a Poe bell. It's a little loud. So the bells might just be the greatest Edgar Allan Poe poem you haven't read. But the people who have read it and who've read it out loud to really hear and feel the music of it can easily get hooked on its beauty. So why don't you give it a try and give the bells a reading out loud today? You might just find yourself singing to the tintinnabulation that so musically wells, to the bells, 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 bells. And it all started under the lights of these candelabra. And if you'd like to help the Poe Museum preserve precious Poe pieces like these candelabra, or Poe's penknife, or even that obnoxious bell, why not become a Poe patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, and I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.